of all, a local variable, so let's just define a few things about local variables. A local variable just means that it's local to the function, so it's what its name sounds like. And if a variable is local to a function, that means that other functions can't access that variable. And so the reason why we haven't really specified the difference between local and global variables and talked about them in depth yet is because before you look at functions, it's hard to understand what the difference is. So now that we've seen different functions, like let's say that we have our int main, and then let's say that we have a bunch of functions down here, so maybe we have int sum. So if we have a local variable inside int main, so let's say that we have int num. So if that's inside the main function, the sum function can't access that variable. So that variable is only available to the main function, or if we had a variable inside the sum function, like let's just say we have int var, that variable is only available to the sum function. Like the main function can't access that variable. So local variables are only available to the function that they're in. And the other thing with local variables is they only exist while the function is executing. And actually, before I say that, I'm just going to write down a few of the things I've said. Local variables are local to the function. Only the function with the local variable can access it. Basically, local variables only exist while the function's executing. So for instance, if we have this variable inside this sum function, that variable only exists while that function is running, so while that function is executing. Once that function ends, that variable is destroyed. So local variables, actually, write that out. So they only exist while function is running. They're destroyed when the function ends. And so if you think about variables in the main function, that's not a huge deal because presumably when the main function ends, your program's done. But if you have a variable inside some of these other functions that you might write, that function might be called multiple times through the course of the program, or through the course of the program executing. So that's one thing to pay attention to each time that this, like let's say we call this int sum 5 different times from the main function. Each time we call it, it's going to recreate this int var, and so let's say that it's initialized to 0, and then we change it to, like, let's say that it gets changed to something else. So let's just say variable is equal to 1 plus 2, and really we'd want to send 2 numbers in as parameters and add them together, but let's just say that we're adding something inside this function, and then it's going to return var. So let's say this function's called once, and I'm just going to do this correctly. So let's say that we're adding A and B. So we send, so this function is receiving A and B, and let's just say it's receiving them from the main function. So let's say we call sum and send it 10, 20. So we call, so we're running through the main function. We get to this function call sum, send it 10 and 20. Down here, this function is going to add those 2 numbers together, so it's going to be 30. It's going to return 30. Now a variable in that function, or var, is equal to 30, but when that function ends, like once it returns that var, that variable ceases to exist. So if we have another function call, let's say we have 20 and 30 this time. When this goes back down to sum, when it gets to this int variable, it's going to recreate it again, and it's going to be equal to 0. So we're going to talk a little bit later how you can save how you can get your functions to save values if you have a function that you might call multiple times and you need it to save one of the variables. So global variables are variables that are defined outside of functions, so all of the functions have access to those variables. So for instance, if we take this int var, and let's say we declare it up here, outside of this function, so it's outside of the main function, it's outside of the sum function. Both the main function and the sum function are going to have access to that variable. It's also going to retain any values that are in that variable through the entire, until the program's done executing. So global variables are actually not a very good idea unless you have a really good reason for having one, because they can make your they can make logic errors really difficult to find. I'll just write that down. So global variables are defined outside of functions. Let's put the functions. And so all of the functions have access to them. Constants are considered okay to have as a global variable because they can't change while the program's executing. So the problem with having just a global variable like that is, let's say that we have and we don't need this defined here because we have it defined outside of the function. So let's say that we have num is equal to plus equal num, and then let's say down here we have num, I'm just making stuff up, but plus equal 2. So really the point is we're changing this global variable in two different functions. So that can make it really difficult to track that variable and keep track of what it's actually equal to. So for an example, let's say that int num is equal to 0. We're going to see in a minute that global variables are automatically initialized to 0. If you don't initialize a global variable to anything, it's going to automatically initialize it to 0. But let's say we have this int num is equal to 0, it's a global variable. We go down here, we go into this main function. Right now it says num plus, this should be plus equal 1. So now we've added, so now num is equal to 1. So if we look at our output, num is equal to 1. But then we call this function here, so we go down into the sum function, and we have num plus equal 2. So now num is equal to 3. Go back up to the main function. Well, in the main function, num was equal to 1, but now it's equal to 3 because it's a global variable. So when we go back up here, num is equal to 3 because we changed it in this sum function. And then we go into the sum function again. So now we're down here, we add 2 more to num, so now num is equal to 5. Since this is a global variable, it's changing it for basically in every function. So now if we go back up to, when we get back up to the main function, num is now equal to 5. Well, the reason why this is an issue is because what if we didn't mean to change num in the function and we thought that it was only being changed in the main function, so we thought that num was equal to 1. So basically, you don't want to use global variables unless you absolutely have a really good reason to be using them, because they can cause logic errors that are really hard to find. They can make debugging difficult. The other issue with using global variables is it can make it so your functions aren't as portable between different programs. So let's say we want to use this int sum function in more than one program. If we have all of our variables that we need for the int sum defined inside int sum, then we can basically just use that with whatever program we want. But if we have our variables for the function defined in the program as global variables, when we try and use that function somewhere else, it's not going to have the variables it needs. So don't use global variables unless you have a really good reason. It is okay to use constant global variables. So, and the only reason they're okay is because they don't change during the course of the program's executing. Even with that, I still usually put the constant variables in whatever function I'm using them in, unless I'm using them in more than one function. If you have like pi or some other constant that's never going to change, and you might be using it in multiple functions for a mathematical operation, then I think it would be okay to use that as a global function. But like in our craps game, remember how I put the constants for the dice inside the dice function, or the dice roll function, and the reason why I did that is because that's the only function we're using those in. So it doesn't really make sense to put those as global variables. Put a constant variable as a global variable. I'm not going to take points off for that, but unless you have a really good reason for having a regular variable as a global variable, don't do that. And unless you want to spend hours and hours finding errors in your code.